Our speaker today is Dr. Jack Alpert. He spoke to us last February, but I want to remind you of some facts about Jack and his work. He's the director of Stanford Knowledge Integration Laboratory. He's an engineer who in 1968 at General Motors helped put seatbelts in cars. Those seatbelts changed the probability of dying in an accident from 1 in 200 to 1 in 20,000. He thought everyone would wear them. They didn't. The frustration made him stop being an engineer and start studying learning. That was 1972. His early research implied that fifth graders, Nobel laureates, have the same abilities to imagine future events and choose behavior to address them. His current work is about how 8 billion people misunderstand the human condition and cannot choose behavior to avoid tragic outcomes. This year's projects at the lab are to create 3 videos that describe to the common person, first, that our civilization is on course to injure almost everyone. Second, a design for a non-injury producing civilization. And third, a transition path from today's civilization to this non-injury design. Jack is showing us the second one today. I await your questions in chat. Over to you, Jack.
This civilization is on course to starve to death almost everyone living during this century. Let me explain. Civilization is a collection of people. Births add to this collection, old age deaths subtract from it, food deliveries feed it. If food deliveries are too small, people starve to death. Let me present 2 food delivery systems. The first delivers food without using fossil fuels. It was practiced in fertile river valleys using people with hose and draft animals. All of Earth's valleys together fed at most 600 million people. The second delivers food using fossil fuels. Today, it produces enough food to feed 8 billion people. If during this century, fossil fuel deliveries decline to near zero, and if other energy delivery systems, wind, solar, nuclear, and fusion, cannot replace them, food production could decline back to that produced by the valleys, which fed only 600 million people. Of the 8 billion living today, some die of old age, most could die of starvation. Those born after today could also starve to death. This century, loss of fossil energy could result in 8 to 10 billion starvation deaths. While these deaths could result just from loss of fossil deliveries, our civilization could also create deaths from anarchy, civil wars, migration, resource wars, nuclear winter, climate disruption, biodiversity loss, pollution, and water scarcity. Maybe we are underestimating our predicament, and maybe we are overestimating our abilities to muddle through. Maybe we should be designing a new civilization where people do not die tragic deaths. What would be that civilization's normal conditions? What would be that civilization's operating rules? These questions have been contemplated for decades. William Catton and David Pimentel, now deceased, were part of the original team. There are numerous others that made contributions. This video is not about the extensive information and computations created by the team. Some of these calculations were only back of the envelope. Some became outdated by 20 years of advancing technology. Some have become outdated by environmental disruptions. This video is just my narrative of the team's process. It will help you visualize this non-injury producing civilization. The video has 2 parts. Part 1 describes the civilization's mass and energy flows, and Part 2 describes the human behavior that directs these flows. The mass and energy flows are similar to the description NASA engineers may have created when they designed the space station. Their model contained many variables which describe the station's infrastructure, production activities, population, and supplies. Their gray arrows describe the flows of astronaut labor to each activity. The red arrows describe the flows of energy to each activity. And the blue arrows describe the flows of mass from supplies to each member of the population, to each productive activity, and to each part of the infrastructure. The blue arrows are bidirectional, denoting that mass flows both in and out of each variable. For example, water is delivered to the astronauts from supplies, and their waste pass through a recycling activity, and the water is returned back to supplies. The engineers ran this simulation until it showed living on the space station would not injure the astronauts. When our team created such a simulation to describe Spaceship Earth, its infrastructure included farms, housing, markets, hospitals, transports, schools, communication conduits, civic facilities, theaters, research and development labs, factories, recycling, military forts, wells, mines, refineries, and power plants. The last two are our civilization's sources of energy. Activities included construction, maintenance, and operation of this infrastructure, plus activities that produce food, goods, civic services, education, healthcare, entertainment, conveyance, communication, R&D, extraction, recycling, and defense. Population was divided into 4 classes: people in development, people at leisure, people working, and people in retirement. The supplies included extractions from the Earth's crust, minerals, metals, oil, gas, and coal and uranium. Revenue from the Earth's natural capital systems, for example, soil, air, water, flora, and fauna, and stockpiles of materials which have already been mined and refined but are not embedded in either infrastructure or produced inventory. When we ran our simulation, starting with today's data and operations, it showed that human injury was produced because of declining energy deliveries, climate change, diminishing air quality, species extinction, soil damage, falling water tables, increasing inequity, and rising conflict. Our team began manipulating this simulation to discover the energy and mass flows that do not create injury. Our search revealed a city-state on Earth circa 2100 where a population could live without producing injury as long as it was operating in isolation from competitors. And the city had no access to fossil fuels, uranium fuels, fusion processes, or solar and wind machines. Instead, the only concentrated power source is hydroelectric dams, like those already in place. We were aware that existing dams over the course of the next 300 years would silt in, diminish their energy deliveries, and people would begin experiencing injury. However, 300 years of advancing technology might bring fusion or some other energy source online, and injuries from decreasing hydroenergy might be avoided. We assume these initial conditions. All of this infrastructure is in place. All of this production and recycling processes are working. All of these people have jobs, food, education, and healthcare. All of these stockpiles have reserves to allocate. There are no mines or wells contributing to these stockpiles. Nature services are being utilized at below their renewing rates, and the only source of dense energy is from hydroelectric dams. Let me show how we imagine the civilization's size. That is, how many people, with what services, with support from what collection of dams. To estimate the population, we needed to know how much energy it takes to support one person, how much it takes to support him and his goods, build and maintain his home, deliver and prepare his food, make and clean his clothes, create his toys, power his services, maintain his military and government, create and maintain his infrastructure, provide his entertainment and recreation, and deliver 12 to 20 years of full-time education. To estimate this energy per capita, we took all the energy used for a year in the United States from all sources to produce all services, then divided it by the U.S. population, 306 million people. After some conversions, the calculation suggested that 96,000 kilowatt hours of energy was expected to support each person. Then we calculated how much energy could be delivered by a collection of existing connected hydroelectric dams. We then divided it by 96,000 kilowatt hours, and the calculation suggested a population of 6 million people. Because our hydro-powered civilization converted primary energy into completed tasks differently than the fossil fuel-powered USA, we had to make some adjustments in the population estimate. For example, fossil fuels, 83% of energy used by Americans when burned to make electricity and run transportation, converts only 1/3 of its energy to work, the black. 2/3 of its energy converts to waste heat, the gray. Conversely, the energy in water behind a dam converts 2/3 of its energy to work, only 1/3 is wasted. So a kilowatt hour coming out of a dam generator took half the input energy than a kilowatt hour coming from a coal-fired power plant. Using hydropower instead of fossil fuels to produce current in a transmission line almost doubled the estimate of our imagined civilization's supportable population. Substituting subway transport for roads, bridges, cars, and parking garages increased our population estimate. Since we imagined an isolated and dense community, there was no need for airports and airplanes. This increased our population estimate. Not including mining, refining, and military increased our population estimate. Strategically locating our civilization's work, farms, manufacturing, and services to minimize transport distances increased our estimate. High-rise buildings use more energy in elevators. However, if the elevator exit people at schools, office, shopping, or subway, total energy for these living situations might be lower than suburban living. This increased our estimate of population. Choosing a location with mild weather lowered heating and cooling needs. This increased our estimate. Advances in technology, for example, changing lighting from incandescent lights to LEDs, increased our estimate. Choosing dams that provide least grid losses, easy access to maintenance trains, low distance to generator and turbine repair service, increased our population estimate. Some dams in the United States were not worth including in our power grid. For example, the Tennessee River dams in the long run required more energy to support them than they delivered. Something we did not consider 15 years ago was that changes in the weather would reduce water flowing into dam reservoirs. Had we considered it, it would have decreased our population estimate. When making steel or concrete, using electric grid energy rather than oil or gas energy takes more energy and lowered our estimate of supportable population. Energy required for extensive recycling reduced our population estimate. There were many changes in the processes that supported the city's population. Some took more energy, some less, and some the same. Each made the supportable population estimate go up or down. While our calculations were crude, when we identified the best dams in the Pacific Northwest, the Colorado River, and Quebec Hydro, their combined energy was enough to support a 10 million person civilization at modern lifestyles if we excluded cars and planes. 10 million was the minimum size of an isolated, self-contained civilization that could create modern healthcare, European housing, high-tech jobs, postgraduate education, urban living, symphony tickets, and the ability to launch kids. If the population was smaller, many of these services could not be provided. We discovered that there were only 3 places on Earth that had enough hydroelectric production connectable in a grid to support 10 or more million people: the Pacific Northwest in North America, China, and South America. These 3 sites had such small ecological footprints that it left 90% of the Earth's land area void of human inhabitants. The demands on the environment would be well below ecological production. Eco-sustainability resulted from limited energy deliveries. My narrative so far discussed only the energy and mass components of the team's imagined non-injury producing civilization. The other components include non-injury producing behaviors of 10 million people and the processes that ensure these behaviors are taken. Finding the processes that constrain normal behavior to facilitate a non-injury producing civilization was not a simple task. It is not the same task as finding these constraints for our present civilization. Our experience was not going to help us. First, the injury events unfolding in our imagined civilization have never previously happened. We had to discover them through simulation. Second, the behavior constraints that would avoid these injuries had never been imagined, let alone tried. Third, to know if any behavior constraint candidates would be effective in preventing injury, we had to simulate 10 million sets of these behavior on the new energy mass civilization. We discovered our constraint candidates by tracing the maps, energy flows, mass flows, conflict creation processes, constituent preferences for activities, and civil management The short narrative in this video cannot provide all of the thinking and discovery that happened over the last decades. However, I can describe some behavior constraints which, if left out of civilization's design, would produce gross injury. I will focus on behavior constraints that prevent community-created injury across generations, and I will not discuss, though they are important, constraints that prevent injuries to individuals or small groups. Let me describe some behavioral constraint candidates we discovered when we traced energy flows. We found our annual energy budget was fixed. Human behavior could not increase it. Behaviors that would open new coal mines or drill new oil wells were constrained. Instead, the sun evaporated ocean water, lifts it into the air, moves it inland over the mountains, rains it down, and streams guide it into reservoirs behind dams. Because dam energy was not adequate to both support civilization and build more dams, dam building behaviors were also constrained. Second, we discovered that energy potential of water behind a dam had a finite life. The water can produce work if it passes through a turbine. However, if it spills over the top of the dam, it produces no work. We had to curtail behaviors like saving water for next year that would cause water to spill over the top of the dam. Our plan was to have these turbines produce 96,000 kilowatt hours 10 million times. If we did not put in some new behavior constraints, some energy would be wasted in conflict. Some would be wasted in inefficient structures like freeways and suburbs. Some would be wasted in repairing things we needlessly broke, for example, pollution cleanup. I will come back to describing the constraints we imagined to prevent wasted energy. Let me focus on the behavior constraints of turbine production that was not wasted. Part was allocated to providing civil services to 10 million people. Each person received basic housing, heat, light, water, garbage, and so on, and full health care. Transport, free subways. There were no roads, cars, or planes. 25 years of education, and public advancement of the arts and sciences. The remaining not wasted kilowatt hours were divided equally among 10 million people. The energy was given like cash in the form of kilowatt hour tokens. Each token was a demand on energy stored in water behind a dam, which meant it was dated for expiration. The implied behavior constraint was use it, accomplish something with the turbine output, or lose it, water flowing over the top of the dam. These energy tokens could be exchanged for food, goods, services, or applied to personal projects. This flow of tokens forms the dominant constraint on behavior in this civilization because it directs actual activities. Food purchases directed agricultural activities that determined if cherries or apricots were grown by farms. Goods purchases directed manufacturing of toasters or sweaters, and service purchases determined the production of symphonies or rock concerts. Personal expenditures drove the invention of new products or the advancement of the arts and the sciences. Kilowatt-hour tokens form an additional constraint on behavior. Goods and services are denominated in energy units produced by turbines. Token flow, turbine output, caps energy-consuming activities. Energy flow contributed more behavioral constraints. However, they will not be presented in this narrative. Next, we will use mass flows to imagine additional behavioral constraint candidates. In our imagined civilization, mass is sourced from stockpiles and revenue from natural capital. No mass is extracted from the Earth's crust. Mass flows through blue channels to civilizations, population, activities, and infrastructure. And since there are no blue channels running off of or onto the map, human behavior must cause everything to be recycled back to its original source. And no land outside of the boundary can be annexed, and no mines or wells can be drilled. An inspection reveals civilization's mass has only 4 classes: unused land, stockpile materials, minerals or land embedded in either an individual's projects or civic projects. We imagine a behavioral constraint that gave control over the transfer of empty land or stockpile material into the possession of an individual or a civic project to a committee representing the next 100 generations. The committee, in determining if a transfer can take place, visualizes if the material can be recycled to its initial condition, or if the land can be returned in its original condition. For example, 1, fossil fuels would never be transferred. They cannot be returned in their original state. 2, the best use of a mass asset is determined by its benefit to the next 100 generations. And 3, high bid for lease of returnable mass determines which project gets possession of a unit of mass. 4, when leases expire, there's no auto renewal. The asset is assigned to the highest bidder for the next period. And 5, the 100-year committee also sets and collects prepaid fees to ensure materials get recycled or land gets restored at the end of the lease, something like a damage deposit or a cleaning deposit in an apartment lease. That way, if the material or land is abandoned by the leasee, it becomes a civic responsibility to return it to its initial condition. If you have not noticed, giving control of mass flows to the 100 Generations Committee converted all 10 million people living in this civilization to being lessees. The only private property owners in this imagined civilization are the next 100 generations. Thus far, we have used energy flows and mass flows to discover additional behavior constraint candidates that limit injury by a civilization. Next, we traced conflict creating processes to identify them. The first behavior constraint candidates we discovered were already built into the spatial layout of the 3 city-states. We named it isolation. Because the location of cities was far apart and there was no transportation connecting them. Also, since each city-state was not allowed to acquire resources outside of its own designated boundaries, resources supporting one did not overlap resources supporting the other. There could be no conflicts over resources. The second set of behavioral constraint candidates were discovered by tracing hierarchical processes that create conflict. One behavioral constraint limiting increases in hierarchy was already in place: minimum basic income, providing an annual delivery of kilowatt-hour tokens to each individual that could not be reduced in number or in energy equivalent, limits impoverishments that could increase hierarchy. Even when basic income people traded their tokens for labor, services, or goods from other people, it did not increase hierarchy. Each party felt parity. However, trading personal labor for wages to complete civil jobs does give the labor seller additional tokens or energy slaves. To limit these increases, the team imagined a constraint on the maximum wage paid for a civil job. For example, the highest paid wage for a civil job could not be more than X times minimum basic income. 2 additional constraint behaviors limit increases in hierarchy: fair hiring practices in distributing civil jobs, and allowing a labor market to determine the wage paid for each civil job. The constraints included fixed-term contracts, open competition at each job's contract renewal, and market-determined wage subject to wage cap. We were surprised when the labor market paid the garbage collector, who does not want to do his job, a higher wage than a research scientist who loves their job and would come to work without pay. We learned from our simulations that high levels of minimum basic income changed how people valued their time and chose their activities. With caps on maximum civil pay and the civil sector being the biggest distributor of kilowatt-hour tokens, a large middle class is maintained, which in conjunction with high minimum basic income flattened increases in hierarchy. Genetic behavior, which encourages superiority and dominance, normally increases hierarchy. However, when it increases invention and efficiency in production processes, it lifts all boats. However, with the sale of goods and services, manufacturers and resellers can accumulate dated kilowatt-hour tokens, which have to be spent or lost. These disenfranchisements do increase hierarchy. The team searched for behavioral constraints that limited these disenfranchisements while keeping the benefits of advances in invention and efficiency. We found these behavioral constraints by tracing the token flows which facilitate leasing of mass, consumption of energy, paying of wages, and amassing of profits. There were already several token flow constraints built into the structure of our proposed civilization. Rain limited the total annual flow. Expiration of kilowatt-hour tokens prevented token saving, and no private ownership of mass prevents wealth accumulation. Further, the value of mass is determined by leases created by the 100-generation managers. The value of a token is equal to a fixed amount of energy. We discovered that the acquisition of a single individual's wages and profit in tokens is not completely constrained by these relationships. Also, a person's annual flow of tokens from commerce produces a purchasing power far greater than that of an individual with minimum basic income plus civil wage tokens. In making their purchases, they create more stuff envy, market distortions which cause disenfranchisement, and investment advantage. More stuff envy increases hierarchy, but not the kind that creates conflict that wastes energy. Investment advantage is often hidden in inventory and contractual barter. So these by themselves do not create a dangerous hierarchy. However, purchasing power that increases the market price of an item enough to disenfranchise a buyer from his normal purchases may be the most dangerous hierarchy producing process. The team wanted people to get rich so they could provide civilization with invention and efficiency without letting them create high levels of disenfranchisement. What kinds of constraints would do this? We look for behaviors that would not inhibit a person's motivation to create these productive processes or damage existing production processes. The constraints we discovered we called intergenerational wealth dilution. We imagined two dilutions. Both have to do with dilution, not diminishment, of the process's value stream at the end of the process creator's life. The first was limitation of the disbursement size. Remember that the rich person owns no mass. He or she leases it from the 100 generation. If he or she has a production facility, mass, it is also leased. So the inheritors are taking on the responsibility to pay these leases. The value to the inheritor of the inheritance is the expected net token flow after paying these leases. The proposed constraint is that this inherited token flow is limited in size to a simple multiple of 96,000 kilowatt hours. A very wealthy person like Bill Gates must give his entitlement in his Microsoft produced token flow away in small pieces. This means to a very large number of people who each receives some multiple of 96,000 kilowatt hours. Instead of creating one heir with a token flow 200,000 times bigger than the biggest civil servant, there are now 50,000 people with incomes maybe 4 times the highest paid civil servant. This intergenerational dilution caps, for the most part, the token flow hierarchy of a civilization. There are a lot of richest people. The second behavioral constraint we imagined is that intellectual property, not mass property, at death moves into the public domain or commons. The people who are beneficiaries of Bill Gates can still sell the Microsoft product or support of the product at market value, but they can no longer have civil law to protect themselves from competition or the products from duplication. Patent or intellectual property rights expire at the death of the creator. We discovered more constraints on behavior created by commercial processes. However, in this narrative, I present just these two. So far, we have derived constraint behavior candidates from energy flow, mass movement, and conflict processes. Next, we will consider behavior constraint candidates derived from constituent activities. There are many places to search for candidates. Let me present 3: habitat considerations, personal responsibilities, and motivations for action. Inspecting habitat led us to constraint behaviors related to mass conservation. Since everything must be recycled, there is no throwing trash over the fence. Since humans are mass, and mass belongs to the next 100 generations, individuals cannot live and die outside the boundaries of the city-state. Since all possessions are leased, not owned, they cannot be permanently removed from the city-state either. Further investigations revealed the importance of habitat density maintenance. If our civilization spread out into the suburbs, it would dilute healthcare, education, transportation, and other services. So we imagine constraints that prevent this suburbanization. Next, we derive constraints from personal responsibilities. With mass ownership assigned to the next 100 generations, with the current mass holders being only a lessee, the required extra constraints on the lessee's behavior came into focus. Limited liability corporations, as they are defined today, would never qualify for a lease. If a group of individuals pools their personal leased mass to make goods to sell, each individual is an independent mass provider to the productive process, and each personally prepaid recycling fees and must pay annual leases. If the group's activities corrupts the individual's leased mass, the individual personally faces cancellation of the remainder of his lease, the forced return of the remaining lease mass, and confiscation of his or her prepayment to the recycling trust. The personal responsibility constraints on behavior discovered because they were related to mass also apply to intellectual property. Civil protections could only be assigned to individuals, not to groups or to corporations. We have looked for behavior constraints using habitat considerations and personal responsibilities. Next, we will investigate behavior constraints based on the individual's motivation for action. People's motivation for choosing activities in our imagined civilization is partly the same as what we have today. Kilowatt-hour tokens accrue from wages and sales of production. However, this motivation is abridged when minimum basic income provides most services through civil actions and a stipend for market participation. This raised the question, is a civilization with a large minimum basic income fair? To make the determination, the team did a little thought experiment to put minimum basic income into a fairness perspective. Each of the team's members asked him or herself what portion of the services he or she consumed results from his or her direct work, and what portion results from work done by his or her invisible 125 energy slaves. We accomplished this by asking what services would go away if we lost our energy slaves. Car, heat, light, grocery store, healthcare, education, almost everything. We realized most of our goods and services were created and delivered by our invisible energy slaves. If, in our imagined civilization, the water behind the dam was the invisible energy slaves, and they were given equally to each individual, where is the unfairness? Thus, since more than basic needs are covered without shame, and there's no requirement to work for additional income, people can spend their time creating good deeds, and art, and science, which reap only non-energy personal rewards. Again, I apologize for not being able to present everything that the team considered. We are nearing the end of my narrative about our search for behavioral constraints that create a non-injury producing civilization. The last search area focused on constraining the behavior of civic managers. There were two civil managements in our imagined civilization. the dam's energy distributors, and the mass conservers. Some constraints for the energy managers were already built into the new mass energy structure. Some additional constraints are still needed to manage their human nature. I describe the constraints provided by structure first. The only levers energy managers can pull were changes in allocation of kilowatt hours for an established list of civic services. The managers could maintain, increase, or decrease energy flow to each of these civic services. The dam energy distributors have three responsibilities. The first is shifting energy among alternative civil services. For example, changing golf courses into soccer fields or vice versa, or more difficult choices like changing allocations of energy from hip replacements to kidney transplants. The second kind of decision shifted dam energy allocations between personal stipends and civic services. For example, like changing the number of years of free education per person from 25 downward to 24 or upward to 26, with a commensurate change in stipend tokens. A third area of behavior constraints that inhibited injury production was giving energy distributors control over population size. Because dam energy was fixed and each person was allotted 96,000 kilowatt hours, an allotment for a newborn was available only if someone died. Therefore, we imagined giving civil management the task of making births equal to deaths. This meant controlling the number of births. While none of us wanted to tell a woman she could not have a child, upon inspection we realized that we did not have the expected problem of too many births. We had the opposite problem, too few. In our small civilization, where each of the 10 million people was needed to make a developed civilization fully operational, too few births meant we would lose services if the population went down. For example, we would lose the first chair violinist in the symphony. This meant to have that violinist, we needed an average of 2 births per woman. We discovered that in a developed society, about a third of the women, by choice or health, chose to have no children, and a third of the women chose to have only 1 child. To achieve 6 births for any 3 women, the third would have to have 5 children. Of course, if she did not want 5, she wanted 4, that would be all right if another woman would have 6. If a woman did not want 4 but wanted 3, it would be okay if another wanted 7. And for any woman that wanted 2, it would be okay if another wanted 8. This meant not only could every woman have as many children as she wanted, there was a good chance that there would not be enough births to maintain the 10 million person population. This condition gave the energy distribution civil management an additional responsibility: provide incentive to some of the women to have an extra child. Now, let me address additional behavioral constraints required to address problems created by human nature of the energy managers. By reviewing present civilizations' representative decision-making processes, it appears our representatives are indifferent to the injuries they create or allow. Instead, they are focused on providing benefits to financial and cultural groups that keep them in office. If we did not want our energy managers creating injury, we had to change the constraints so they would not be responsible to these constituencies and would not have to horse trade their votes or stand for re-election. This meant changing their selection processes and their deliberation processes. We considered suggestions by Kim Stanley Robinson in his Mars trilogy. His civil servant managers were randomly conscripted from the adult population like jurors. They had no special skills, knowledge, or motivations for power. For the task of maintaining or changing the flows of energy allocations for a list of civil services, any adult was equally adequate. He or she came prepackaged with personal preferences. We imagined these constraints for each selected manager. Serve only once in their lifetime. Duration of service was fixed, was unpaid, deliberations were not public, and votes were not public, even to the other managers. Each vote holds constant raises or lowers the token allocation for a civil service. Since the total energy flow is fixed, cumulative changes for a series of allocations has to balance. The legislative agenda follows a sequential list of civil services. Each new manager gets to vote on elements of this list as they are sequentially attended to. He or she has no control over which portion of the list will be addressed during his or her period of service, just as a juror does not get to seek the kinds of trials on which they serve. New or extinguished civil services are not covered in this narrative. Each chooses his or her own staff to help with their research. However, the staff serves at no pay, is isolated from outside influences, lobbyists, serves for a parallel time period of the energy manager they serve, and each cannot staff another manager in their lifetime. The team discussed hundreds of ideas to constrain the energy manager's behavior. However, they could not be included in this brief narrative. Next, let me describe behavioral constraint candidates that could be applied to the civil management group charged with protecting the mass assets for the next 100 generations. First, let me describe some of the decisions they make that could be shaped by behavioral constraints. In leasing the 100 generations assets to the present generation, the mass management team decides best alternative project for the asset using the view of the next 100 generations and best chance of return of asset without damage. Mass that could not be recycled, for example, fossil fuels, would not be leased because oil once burned cannot be returned in its unburned condition. Phosphorus might not be leased if its use puts it at risk of dilution to a point where it could not be recovered and returned to storage. To ensure that the lease mass was returned in its initial condition, the managers established prepaid recycling fees, like an apartment cleaning deposit, except that the deposit is made in energy units. For example, energy units facilitate the recycling and return to storage of the original lease mass. While the mass conservers enforce this mass distribution and reclamation within the civilization's boundaries, mass beyond this boundary is treated by the management group as if it is already leased to the external environment. The civilization exports no mass, and no mass is imported. Ecosystem water and air that do pass the boundary are monitored by these managers, who assign import and export duties, if any. Like the energy managers, the mass managers were susceptible to their own emotions, experience, and cultural immersion. And without some very special behavioral constraints, their normal choices would create injury. The proposed constraint on behavior would have to prevent each manager from acting normally. The constraint would make each manager act as if their unborn distant cousins are more important than their living families. Act as if they personally were going to live not tomorrow, but in 200 years. The constraints would cause the managers to see and prefer or reject outcomes that have never existed. Our initial analysis suggested the constraints could not exist. How does an individual use values that have never existed? Maybe an AI could make rational decisions without these human limitations. AI might be able to create values which are extensions of our rationality, not our visceral feelings created by selection, experience, or cultural bias, all of which are tainted by a yet to be evolved cognitive ability that gives abstract future events meaning in decision making. For more details, see 50 Years of Work at skill.org. I have come to the end of my narrative. Let me summarize. We used flows of mass and energy to discover behavioral constraints that contribute to a non-injury producing civilization. We proposed several dozen behavior constraints that, if omitted from any civilization, would cause injury to the population or the ecosystem. The constraints are necessary but not sufficient to prevent all injury. They were not designed to prevent battery theft or discrimination. The mere installation of the constraints caused injury, like installing a stop and go light at a busy intersection to prevent injury. Our proposed constraints abridge normal freedoms. Which brings us to the first crux of implementing our proposed constraints. For people to implement additional constraints on themselves or others, the injury created by the constraint must appear less than the injury resulting from no constraint. For example, the injury of putting on a seatbelt must appear less than the injury of not wearing it. The injury from having to stop at a traffic control light must appear less than the injury of the intersection without the light. Which brings us to the second crux of creating a non-injury producing civilization. The chooser must be able to give meaning to abstract injuries of a not yet occurred event. The chooser must be able to compare the imaged injury to injuries created from a not yet tried constraint. Finally, the comparison is complicated because the two abstract sets of injuries do not happen in the same time frame or to the same people. To help incorporate these competing abstractions into the design of a non-injury producing civilization, it might help to visualize how civilization works. It's complicated. There are lots of cities, farms, manufacturing facilities, mines, wells, and many transportation systems. If this is your view of how things work, it gives no indication of where the world is going. To overcome the failure of vision, this video breaks the whole world into a few simple interacting chunks and uses them to show which behaviors create which conditions. Let me begin by using 4 simple machines to describe the whole world: humans, plants, weather, and animals. Plant machines convert sunlight into food. Weather machines convert sunlight into wind, rain, rivers, and valleys. Non-human animal machines convert solar-created food into meat. Human machines gather plants and animals and use them to replace worn-out machines. Using all the surface of the world, sunlight can support 100 million machines. The same sunlight can support 100 million hunter and gatherers. When human machines do more than hunt and gather, they also burn wood, plant crops, and domesticate animals, and this configuration spreads over the whole Earth. Sunlight supports 600 million. Next, imagine that each human machine has 2 attached tanks, something like your car's gas tank, one filled with coal, oil, gas, and uranium, and the other with minerals and metals. With these tanks, each human machine can provide more than a few replacement machines. They can produce goods and services. and they can produce machines that perform all kinds of additional processes. When the tanks of each machine is full, 7.8 billion of them can be productive on Earth. However, when any machine's tank runs dry, its production ends. Of the 7.8 billion machines, 600 million solar-powered machines keep producing, while 7.2 billion machines with empty tanks stop. To prevent this civilization contraction, some machines were set up to work extracting resources from the Earth's crust, transporting it, refining it, and piping it into their tanks. Some were set to work building and maintaining the supporting infrastructure, and some were set to work manufacturing replacement machines. Using crustal resources, the tanks of 7.2 billion machines can be kept full. Sunlight supports the rest. However, there is a problem. These energy and material delivery machines were designed to do their extraction from the richest locations in the crust, those having the shortest transportation distance and those where it was the easiest to process. When these locations are mined out or pumped dry, the machines had to move their extraction activities to reservoirs and ore bodies that were deeper, smaller, and less dense. That required greater mining infrastructure, additional transport, and more processing. On this path to ever lesser quality mining sites means the consumption of the machines tasked with obtaining and delivering energy and materials eventually exceeds their production, and their tanks are empty. While the 600 million sunlight-powered machines keep producing, everything else stops. Let's assume that the machines could foresee this decline in delivery of energy and materials to 7.2 billion machines and the contraction of their civilization. They try to create new machines like solar panels, wind turbines, and fusion reactors, and new infrastructure to support them. They hope this new production will replace the energy and materials that can no longer be delivered from the crust. However, if these efforts don't keep these tanks full, this machine civilization will contract to just the sun-powered machines. Now, does this simple big chunk model help us see how our world works? Let's replace these machines with people. Earth is feeding 7.8 billion people. People are mining minerals and pumping energy reservoirs until they can't. The development of alternative energy and material delivery systems don't seem to be coming online fast enough. So in our future, maybe in 2100, when we cannot extract crustal resources, sunlight will feed 600 million people like 17th century serfs. Most of the global population that lives after 2050 will experience starvation. And during the next 80 years, 8 to 10 billion people could starve to death or die in conflict over food. Maybe this chunky model can tell us some other possible futures. In 2100, the sun will still be shining. Ocean water will still be evaporating. Rain will still be falling in the mountains. Rivers will still be filling existing reservoirs behind dams. These dams will still be creating enough electric power to allow 50 million people to live almost our present lifestyles. That is, if they will confine their homes to 3 specially designed cities located to obtain their energy from today's hydro dams, and they will constrain their behavior as defined by some new social rules. These social rules have some other benefits. They prevent civilization from returning to bad conditions. Because civilization contraction does not include collapse, the arts and sciences are not lost and continue to advance, which means new energy sources might be implemented. The ecosystem can recover because the footprint of 50 million people constrained to live in 3 city-states uses less than 2% of the globe's land area. 98% reverts to the state, resulting from no human inhabitants. During the contraction from 7.8 billion people to 50 million, the new social rules of behavior allow people to die of old age instead of starvation and conflict. In making these predictions, this chunky model has not included the effects of advancing technology. For example, dark energy or fusion energy deliveries change these predictions. However, should these advances not arrive on time, this chunky model predicts 7.8 billion sets of human behavior will determine if civilization contracts to either 600 million serfs or 50 million moderns. Humankind has the chance for a bright future. However, they have to choose behavior very carefully. Thank you for listening. I hope this video has helped you visualize a civilization where people do not die from starvation and conflict. This
So Jack, if I can thank you very much for the presentation. I can just see part of your head.
All right.
And perhaps we can move into the question and answer period. Everyone has access to the chat line. And so because several people have asked more than one question, I'm going to start at the top of the chat line and just move down. So people will be able to see themselves who is next in line for the next question. So Jack, I'm going to start off with a question. The only advantage I have is to ask the first question. And so I must confess, I have watched your presentation 3 times in the last 24 hours. I've been shaking my head. I'm getting a headache. There's so many factors and so much to imagine and to try and sort out. I'm overwhelmed. I don't know how you put it all together, but thank you for that. I'm sure there are all sorts of questions of what the assumptions have been made and who was involved in doing these. But recently I heard that someone was busy modeling to determine the different times that fossil fuels would be available to us. Have you heard about that? Because that gives some time concept. You're talking about 2100. Is that still in tune, or have you seen the results of that particular study?
Well, I think, there's many studies, and but almost all of them assume that the decline in fossil fuels will be somewhere between 3 and 8% a year, which means that by 2050, British Petroleum thinks we're going to be down 50%.
Wow.
By going out to 2100, it's pretty easy to see that there's an insignificant amount of fossil energy for us to use to feed a big population. Right. And maybe at that point, we'll realize we shouldn't be burning it up. We should be using it for other things.
Yeah, okay, great. So because the survival of your civilization is dependent upon the hydroelectricity, should we be looking at other places in the world to create more hydro projects? I mean, Africa has no part in this at all. I'm sure there are several places there where hydro projects are feasible. And should we be planning ahead for the ultimate sort of destination and having more hydro electricity available for us?
Well, all the really good sites have already been used. They're talking about the new Millennium Dam on the Blue Nile, but it's not that big. I mean, it's not enough to support 10 million people.
Right.
And the other part one would be the Congo. There is, Victoria Falls.
Yeah.
But even when you add those together, they don't produce enough for 10 million people. It's not a critical mass. And the cost of building those dams is enormous. If we spend all our money building, 5% more power to get our city, one more city, we wouldn't be able to hold the existing population together. I mean, my work suggests that if the population dropped very rapidly, it still wouldn't drop rapidly enough to get to the point where we only had 50 million people left to move into these cities. So there's things that we can do that make our chances of making the transition smaller, and the things that we can do to make transition bigger.
Well, other factors involved as well. I was in Victoria Falls in 2018, and I believe in 2019 or 2020, there was no water running over the falls. A seasonal thing. Okay, and so a lot of these things are not within our control as well. I'm going to move on then to the questions, and so I'm starting at the top of the list. And Stephen Kurtz, I'm not too sure if that was a question or an observation. Would you like to ask Jack that question?
Well, the last sentence is the question, but I had to place my perception or evaluation. And if Jack can't read it, there is a huge difference between conceivable design and probability of implementation. Human nature isn't likely to be amenable to the design. Why design something which has a near zero chance of succeeding? That's the question.
That's a really good question. I created the design to show what a target civilization would look like, and so that we could recognize how far our current civilization is from that condition. So when we're talking about will people vote to change, to constrain other people's behavior, and I'm not expecting it to happen country by country. I'm expecting it to be a consensus of 8 billion people forcing their will on the remaining groups, which you've already defined as completely unwilling and uninterested and belligerent in terms of having new constraints placed on themselves. So, do we have a big probability of making this transition? No, the probability is very small. I could have told you that in 1972 when I started this. My field is dynamics. I knew the meadows in 1968, and the fact is, we could, from a dynamic system point of view, we were toast then. There was no path out. That doesn't mean that we can't find one with it, or that there isn't a process that could. I can imagine some processes that would allow this transition. Maybe it would be top down. My model is bottom up. I don't know. Stephen, we've had this conversation for 20 years, you and me. So, and you've been very consistent, and I have been very open to your ideas, except that I'm still looking for the breakthroughs. I don't have them, but that doesn't mean that I should stop working on the problem, because the probability of success is almost zero. Because the alternative is just to sit around getting, watching the system crumble and get wasted. And I don't have to do that. Does that satisfy you as why you and I are still in different positions?
Sure. No changes.
No changes.
Right.
Thanks.
Everybody realizes that that Stephen feels very clearly we are in very hot water and there's no recovery. And that if any plans that we make to get out of hot water have got to at least reflect his reservations. I'm willing to do that. I'm
No,
still working.
You're really putting words in my mouth. Sorry for extending this, but I believe it's the variables are so chaotic and numerous that managing this when we can't even manage with international trade is, to me, hitting your head against the wall. The population will shrink, but it's not going to be pretty, and the management's going to have to be done on the fly, and there's too many variables. A nuclear button could take out 80% of the population tomorrow. So anyway, I'm going to shut up.
Okay, thank you
Stephen.
both for that. I'm going to move on then to Bill Reese. Bill, can you just do your first question, please, at this time?
I believe he's moved, he has left. So Raymond Larry's up next.
Okay, so Raymond Larry, then can I move on to you, please?
Sure. Actually, I put two questions and comments in there, but I guess the one of them is that 15 years ago, I remember actually it may have been a bit more than 15 years ago, there was an article in National Geographic that talked about the prospects of energy and all that and over the future. And at the time, wind and solar were very expensive, and the thought was that they could only because it would require subsidies to deploy them, they were really only viable for small percentages of our energy. Roll forward 15 years, and they're now the cheapest sources of energy available out there. And actually, hydro. So you talk in your model about existing hydro, which is a bit of a different thing because costs are, were incurred a while in the past. So the current cost of electricity is relatively low, but the wind and solar are excluded for some arbitrary reason. I'm not sure why, but from my perspective, you talk about the cycle of the sun evaporating water and putting water back in reservoirs. Well, it's the same thing with the sun and wind. The wind will continue blowing, the sun will continue shining for several billion more years. Why not exploit those natural resources, which could be used to give us plentiful source of energy?
That's a really good question. The difference between putting water in reservoirs is that we didn't build a machine to do it. And that to get energy out of wind or energy out of the sun from solar voltaics, we have to build machines to get the energy. In the process of building, and like that, those machines only have a finite life, 20 years, 25 years, and then we have to rebuild them. And so the question is, how much energy, let's assume that a solar panel could be, it looks like it could be made for, much less money, 5% of the cost that it was 15 years ago. And, people can say it can go farther, it can go to zero, but that's not where the expense is. The expense is rebuilding it. And whether or not, if you had an island like Japan and you put windmills around it and you converted the island to work completely on the energy that came from the windmills, and you moved all of the basic materials into Japan and then put a fence around it and said, nobody in, nobody out, would the windmills be able to keep the civilization going? Is there enough energy coming out of the windmills to constantly maintain them and run all the activities? And when you run those numbers, it's not a dollar thing, it's an energy thing. There isn't enough net energy from a windmill to rebuild itself and to support other parts of civilization.
Well, again, that might have been true 15 years ago, and that was reflected in the cost. But today, if you look at measurements of the global wind capacity, it's something like 40 times what we need for all the electricity we do today. And solar, just 1 hour of insolation throughout the planet is enough for all of our energy uses, electricity, fossil fuels, and everything in a year, right? So there's plenty of sunshine and plenty of wind to go around. So yes, you need to refresh the infrastructure once in a while, but that's no different with dams. I mean, they do have to maintain the generating capacity. They do have to, as you point out, they have to do desilting activities at some point. So there is a cost there too, right? So
There's a
anyways,
couple of there's a couple of very good people working in this field. One is Simon Michon, and you should look up his work. He's a mining geologist who works for the Finnish Geological Society, and he's done some very good work about the probability of being able to find the materials to make enough solar panels or enough wind turbines to actually it doesn't solve the problem of the windmill has to put out enough energy to replace itself and support, but he's talking about whether or not we can actually gather together the resources from the crust to make the panels and make the wind turbines. And he's saying that we can't, it doesn't even look like we can make the first round. Like if we started right now to try to build all these wind turbines, the other person that you want to reference is Mark Zucker. What's Mark? There's a Stanford prof that's proposed exactly your solution. Is there enough wind, and is there enough hydro, and is there enough solar panel that we can run all of civilization on new panels? All we have to do is have the will to build them. And he's been soundly discredited. And Simon Michon is, his 90-page paper is exquisite. You should read it. It will answer your questions much better than I can in just a few sentences. I'll tell you what, if you email me, I'll email you copies of both papers.
okay, I'll email you.
Okay.
Do you have?
I lost your
Thanks, Raymond.
audio.
Yeah.
Sorry,
So-
can the email be put in the chat?
It's Alpert@skill.org. If you can spell skill with one L and my name, Alpert@skill.org is my email.
It's also on the invitation, Raymond.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Raymond.
Thanks.
Bill Reese actually had posed a question since he's left. I'm going to read it to you, Jack. And his question was,
He left.
were there any ethologists, psychologists, or sociologists on your team?
Actually, well, I don't know. I think that there were people on the team that were sensitive to sociological conditions. Yes. I mean, if I can speak for Bill, I wish he stayed present, but his feeling is that we can't get the existing political system to be a part of any transition. And I think he's correct. And I'm sorry that he left.
As they say in French, séparé. I'll move on to Art. Art, do you have a question, please?
Yeah, Jack, looking at your model, one of the things that struck me was your ability to recycle. And of course, the second law of thermodynamics is still going to be functional. There's no such thing as 100% recycling. And so that's a fundamental flaw, I would suggest, in your modeling. The other thing that struck me, of course, falls back onto what Raymond was just saying, that after the transition, there's still going to be, as it were, archives in ancient cities and what have you. I mean, the dams survived, and that became part of the new society. Clearly, there's cities full of material, facilities, equipment, and what have you. How how have you modeled that into your mass flows?
Well, that's in the third video. And if you go to the website and you go to the section called Unwinding the Human Predicament, it actually talks about how the mass is going to be handled during the transition.
Okay.
It's the third video that talks about, all I wanted to do in this video was to create a target. What does a target civilization look like? And the third one says, and the first video says, we're in deep trouble. This one's going down. And the third video says, how do you get from our current course to this new destination? So you're right. I'm not the new 50 million person, the three cities will have in their storehouses all the things that can be scavenged. Okay. And not that the population that's going away all over the world, they're dying of old age, but the idea that as part of this commitment, they have to decommission all of the infrastructure that's in place that would poison the world. Okay, so the 8 billion people that are not moving to these three cities are in the process of taking apart existing civilization so that it doesn't poison the whole thing. All right. Now, how long your original statement, which says you can't recycle 100%, the question is whether or not these storehouses in these three cities have enough to keep it going with losses. With losses, meaning you can't recycle 100%. So the idea and the thing about dams, these dams are not expected to produce energy after 300 years, at least not. They'll be silted in. They'll have intermittent energy. So this is just a transition model, not the constraints will hold up beyond the resources, but in 300 years we'll have to have another energy source. The question is whether or not we can keep our technology together well enough to have an opportunity to get to it.
You happy, Art?
Yeah, well, I mean, the second law of thermodynamics is there, and it's still going to be around. You can't unscramble the egg, as it were.
Well, no. The second law of this, it's not a closed system. The energy that comes from evaporation and ends up going through the turbine is dissipated. It comes from the sun. If the sun went out, you don't have any turbine water.
No, I got no problem with that natural cycle. I'm talking more about when you're building things and to survive, and you're making homes and schools and things.
The new cities are going to have to be made with the existing fossil energy that exists. I'm not counting on solar energy to build these cities.
Yeah.
I'm not counting on these cities to use solar photovoltaics or wind to run themselves.
Yeah, but it's things like wood will rot. You know, it's you cannot unrot wood.
No, but forests continue to grow. But I'm not running these cities off of wood pellets either.
So the only thing then we're debating is where are the city boundaries?
They're
very big.
That got left out of this particular discussion. There was a huge amount of work done by David Pimentel about where the valleys are, where the cities are, the soils people, where the farms are going to be, whether or not we did a lot of work on rotating farms, and the rotation was not 7 years, it was 300 years. It was, where is the land area where we start with a forest, cut it down, plant the crops, use it for so many years, and then move on to the next thing. And 300 years later, we come back and use that piece of property again. There were things like where's the meat coming from, and we modeled bison, since there's no fences in the prairie, and the bison move north and south across this railroad that we put in between Buffalo, New York, and Portland. We harvested the buffalo herd to create meat for 10 million people. We did the calculations to demonstrate that there was enough meat that we would not diminish the herd, and it would use the entire grazing area of like 17 states to feed the buffalo, but we didn't pay anything for it. Okay, now that there is some biofuels left, and the way we were going to get our biofuels was we did calculations to demonstrate that just the slaughter of just the animals that we use to make meat for the 10 million population created a certain amount of biodiesel, and that we would still have some biodiesel capabilities. It would be fringe, but it would be there. But I mean, the idea is that this is the parts that got left out. I couldn't include everything, but there, you can't imagine that we spent 20 years on this, and that a lot of the elements weren't looked into. I mean, you and I should have this on the side, because it's really interesting, but it's not this little piece of it that says, what does a non-injury producing civilization look like?
So Jack, you associated with go ahead, Art.
No, I'll move on. I'm done. Thank you.
Okay. So Jack, associated with what Art was talking about, you're talking about dams being good for 300 years. What about the turbines and the maintenance of those and replacement of the turbines?
There's a guy in Denver who's the team's turbine expert. That's what he does.
Right.
Okay. He knows where the turbines are built, and where those companies are, and how often they have to be maintained. It depends upon how much dirt's in the sediment.
Right.
Because the dirt in the sediment essentially ruins your turbine and ruins your flues. And the idea was, do we get enough energy out of the turbine, out of this 96,000 kilowatt hours, 10 million times? Is there enough energy left to actually maintain those turbines and those dams, but not build them?
No.
And not desilt them, as Raymond pointed out.
Right. So I think Bill Reese left a bit early, because his next question was to you. How do you dispose of the other 8 billion people on Earth, i.e. those not invited to your 3 cities? Now, you talked about that in the latter part of your presentation, but I think he left before that. Okay, well, there's no problem getting rid of 8 million people in 100 years. 8 billion. No. They die. They die natural deaths. There's no problem with that at all. The problem is that you have to make sure that you replace them with a very small number of people. Right. All right. So we'll lose 100 million people a year through old age. And when we get to the 78th year, you got 7.8 billion people who have died of old age. Right. I mean, that's simple math. Yeah. It's preventing the follow-on for new babies, right? Well, no. Or controlling them. The social contract that the constraint on behavior is that the 8 billion people have to vote to have 8 billion people sterilized. And then they're going to give out somebody 50 million birth permits a year. And so if you give out, 500,000 birth permits a year. So if in 100 years, you end up with a population of 50 million people. Okay, so everybody is sterile, and that's part of the deal. People have to ahead of my time. People have to agree that 8 billion people first off, half of those people don't want to be sterilized. It's sort of like abolition. You can't go ask the slave owners whether or not they want to give up their slaves. But you have another community that says, if we don't give up slavery, we're going to be horrible people. And they superimpose their will on the others. Now, the question that Steve brought up is, will it be a political decision, or will it be bottom up, or will it be authoritarian, or as Steve suggested, we could kill 80% of that 8 billion people in a weekend. Right. I think the next question is related from Peter Bukowski in some way. Peter?
Yes. Recognizing human nature, which all central planning and control ignores, how do you really expect to impose such a system that exceeds anything that Stalin attempted in the Soviet Union, short of guns, gulags, and the SS? Do you really believe that you could build a society of 50 million people after you've eliminated the 8 billion, recognizing you're going to do that 100 million or so a year? Do you think that that would really be a stable society given the nature of human beings? Some are saints, some are sinners. Do you really think it's sustainable?
There's two things going on here. The question is whether or not you're going to have radical individuals. And the answer is, Steve's right, you're never going to get rid of them. The question is whether or not those radical individuals have enough power in a society I mean, look at your own city. You have a couple of 3 Sigma people that are sociopaths or psychopaths, and you have, but your city is basically still working pretty well. And so the answer is, what do we have to do to keep a group of people from being unhappy with their position in this civilization and then blow it apart? Or what keeps a group of people who don't like giving up their slaves? You know, how did we make that stick? It turned out to be a really bloody war. And we don't want that. But the fact is, the people who didn't want to be sterilized are going to be really unhappy about it. And it got pushed down their throat by the 3 billion that wanted it. And once you don't have babies, and once you have an aging population, your dissidents disappear. You're not growing new ones. You're just getting rid of the old ones.
I think you're assuming that these people, that 50 million will be happy. Arthur C. Clarke, The Lion of Kamar, sort of addresses that in a different way, but I don't see that. But you clearly believe that such a society is sustainable and viable, and a place where those people would want to live.
Yeah, well, take a look at the space station, and that there's a finite number of people in a finite number of spaces, and they have figured out a set of rules that nobody's taken a gun to the space station and murdered anybody else.
That's a very different circumstance.
Oh, now hang on. You said, is it possible? And the answer is yes, it is possible. Now, what you live in a city, which city do you live in?
Calgary,
Peter,
which is a disaster.
Which one?
Calgary,
Calgary.
where we have sustainable priorities, and we're spending a couple of $2 billion building stuff on the Elbow River floodplain.
Okay, so the question is, if you were in control of Calgary and you could put a fence around it, could you figure out a way to make it stable?
No.
No. Okay. Well, I worked with a team of guys that thought that we could. Okay. They weren't all idiots, and they had to give up. They had to give up some of their beliefs in what could happen. I mean, somebody believed that we could put guys on the space station and they wouldn't kill each other. And then they try to work it out. They put in whatever constraints they had to make sure that, you know, nobody wanted to smoke on the space station when the other people didn't want to, you know, share the smoke.
Yes, sir.
I mean, you're bringing up good points, And you're talking about a very difficult transition. But the first question is it possible to have a civilization made up of human beings with their human idiosyncrasies to keep from, you can have a wacky person, you just can't have a wacky subgroup that can disrupt it. Now, in Calgary, there's a subgroup that are developers, and they've bought the land and they're trying to get the political system to allow them to develop it. And the unorganized people in Calgary haven't taken the energy to make sure that these developers don't get control of the political system. You guys are sitting on your hands. My best example of that is that if women want the right to an abortion, they make up half the population of the United States. They ought to be able to disenfranchise any political operative, remove him from office and make sure that nobody else gets in. All they got to do is vote as a bloc. Do you believe that?
No,
No,
We're
you
waiting
don't
for
think?
November.
no.
I don't know what's going to happen in
Half
November.
the population that are women are not all of the same mind on all of these issues. So the idea that you're going to have a block, except when you have a very specific group with an agenda that gives them more power or benefits, the block voting doesn't happen.
Okay. Do you think that are you familiar with what happened with the amendment in the United States that did prohibition? Where they made it illegal to make alcohol?
Yes, and it failed.
Wait a minute. Your definition of failure has nothing to do with how they got the amendment passed. It only has something to do with that it didn't stick.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, but they got it to pass.
Yes.
Can you imagine how they did that?
Amongst other things, the Women's Temperance Union, the various religions, and the damage that unconstrained alcohol consumption was doing.
All right, so they somehow got their act together and they got the amendment.
Anyway, could we move on?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to cut that off then. Thank you.
Thank you.
Raymond Leary, I'm going to go back to your other question, please.
Okay, so as I say in my comment there, what you're describing, Jack, is a society where there's a high degree of central planning, right? And by the way, central planning doesn't mean communism. It means someone decides what happens from some location for a bunch of other people who just implement the choices, right, or the decisions. And I would argue that one of the that large companies, large either publicly traded or private companies, are actually that type of a system where, you see some fail because of that, because people at the top don't realize what's happening at the bottom and make bad decisions, right? So, so you're describing a system where there would be highly centralized planning. And my question to you is that we've seen instances, so China pre the economic liberalization and other instances where that hasn't worked out really well. So do you really think that it's possible for us to have some anointed individual somewhere who will decide for the rest of us what's the best decision in just about every instance and possibly make that work, given that it's hard enough to get people on this call to agree on things that
Okay, so first off, this civilization is completely market driven. It's completely distributed. There's no central planning at all. Whether or not you have cherries or apricots is completely dependent on who puts up the money for the cherries and who puts up the money for the apricots. All right. You're talking, there's an energy flow in the system and it's completely distributed. There are no limited liability corporations. Everybody is an independent leaser. Okay. And it's actually a perfect democracy. Which decision are you imagining that somebody else made for you?
Well, decisions on how much energy you get, how much, how much
No.
free
Oh,
education is
hang on.
provided, all these things, right?
Wait a minute. The thing is set up, and every year they make a round of decisions. Okay. And the person who makes the decision is this randomly selected juror. He doesn't represent any constituency. He doesn't have to stand for election. He's like a juror in a jury box.
Yeah, but again, this
Now,
harks back. This
wait a
harks
minute,
back to the Soviet Union.
No,
and
there's
the
no
commun-
connection whatsoever.
Yeah, there is, because the individuals there were the free market, in the sense that they were able to choose from what was available, right? But the point is,
The
there's central authorities deciding how much.
The Soviet Union had a 5-year plan where they decided which acres were going to be planted in potatoes and which acres were going to be planted in wheat. And that was a central authority. That's what you're talking about. There's none of that. There's none of that in this design. I mean, if people don't want to eat wheat and they're going to want to eat corn, then the people who want to go out there and grow wheat won't, because there's no market for it. It's completely market driven. There is no central authority whatsoever.
Okay, well, that wasn't my reading.
Well, I know, but you have to follow. Don't follow the money. Follow the kilowatt hour tokens.
Mm-hmm.
Where did they come from, and where did they go to, and who had control over the flow? And you'll see it's completely distributed.
Okay, thanks, Jack. And so I'm going to move on to Cloud Buettner.
Yes, and I hope you can hear me.
Very well, thank you.
Okay, very good. I'm not sure where to start, but I'll start out in a very positive way and kind of go into other areas. I consider this whole plan a very interesting thought experiment in the same way that Einstein used, let's imagine we're a wave of light. And but a lot of the assumptions, I just can't see where they have much to do. On top of everything else, there is no one in charge. And then that assures me that it's a utopia that won't take place. So I'll give you my background as a world federalist. Legitimacy is always part of the debate. How do we legitimize a more empowered UN? How do we change the charter so that right now we have one country, one vote. So 1.5 billion people, that country has the same vote as a small Pacific island with 10,000 people. No legitimacy can come out of a system like that. So what I jumped to actually is Mao was right. Political power comes out of a barrel of a gun. This discussion, if someone had said Art is going to be the guy this year to make all the decisions, basically dictator of the moment, that's not very legitimate either. And he's going to make the decision based on what the planners and the engineers have come up with. Sooner or later, someone pulls out a gun and says, I'm in charge, because this is life and death for me and my family. And I think that's the other thing. And I ask a question there. How about the 7.4 billion people that have been basically relegated? You're disposable. You're not part of our plan. Go die early, please. I think that the end of this will not be people dying of old age because everyone submits to being sterilized. I don't care. We're all old. We're not concerned with that. But a lot of young people would say, like hell, I'm going to be sterilized because I've got some land up north. And by the way, I've got a cousin in Canada and he's invited me up there or whatever. The idea that there would be empty land, I think, is preposterous. I'm thinking of the line from the movie Gandhi where, we don't want mass manufacturing, mass production. We want production by the masses. And I think that that we won't have 10 million people in a city. We're going to have 10 million people in little huts, which will have a very low energy need because they're going to return to solar. Passive solar is really the savior that will keep people alive in a world that's falling apart. So
What's the question?
the question is, have you looked at the way, for example, McMurdo Bay, McMurdo, 5,000 people living in Antarctica, is actually run by Raytheon, a defense contractor. The Navy has actually, in the book, by the way, the Ministry for the Future, they have
Tim Stanley Robinson.
Yeah,
About McMurdo. Yes.
Yeah,
and that's where, but that came from his work.
Okay.
The Mars trilogy.
But remember the character who's a woman in the Navy, she says the Navy should run this. So more and more, when you describe your utopia, I think of a Navy installation. I think of 5,000 people living on an aircraft carrier.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that kind of underscores that, whether you realize it or not, the future, if it exists, at any level, is going to be militarized. The oldest ism before communism or democracy or, all these other isms, it was the guy with the club, and I got a bigger club. Well, I've got a spear. I've got this.
Claude, you don't have to go any farther. I completely agree with your model. Okay. If that's the model that we're going to continue using by default, maybe just, 8 billion people all doing their own thing, clumping together in groups, then we know what the outcome's going to be. The question is there an alternative model that doesn't have the destination that you firmly believe is going to be the destination?
Oh, because I think chaos.
We can't keep going right. We can't keep going round and round from one, from Babylonia to Greece to Rome to Gaul to, the European countries. The Chinese were doing the same thing. They were going through different dynasties. If that's the model of human existence, we know we're done.
Okay, so that's the strange thing is that I'm listening, and in one sense, we're all doomers. You're holding out this olive branch of hope, and we're looking at it saying, that doesn't look very practical to me.
That's what Steve
I think
says.
You're basically stuck with the same conclusion, is that there is a global warming where it does not abate for centuries. On a human time scale, we're going to experience chaos and disaster.
All right,
and my hope is that there will be few survivors, but you're 10 million people living in harmony and not attacked by outside people who are starving to death. That just doesn't have the ring of truth. Remember, during Iraq, all those suicide bombers were going to be, where are they going to get new? That was almost a joke. Where are they going to get new suicide bombers? The truth is, when people are angry enough, they don't care for their life. That's actually the fear that I have for the future, is that when people realize that the government around them cannot guarantee their future. And then what I've read, and this is not my thoughts, these are other people's thoughts, when they lose the value of money, and that's, by the way, what I love about what you do, energy is the money. And I love that focus, because energy should be very expensive so that we don't burn too much of it. So it's both I'm applauding and then at the same time saying I can't relate to it really.
Well, the question is, would you be willing to meet on every Wednesday at 10 o'clock with 4 other people to talk about where the chinks are and what we'd have to fix and what kind of constraints we would build and why people? I mean, right now we have a constraint in our civilization that says you can't beat your wife because she's your wife.
Yep.
Okay. I don't know how it got there, but we put it there and it works in most places. The question is, are there a few more from an engineering point of view? Are there constraints that we have to put in place, or we're all going to be wife beaters or civilization beaters?
So a lot of the work, I think, has been done with the fear of the nuclear war. You Can Survive the Bomb was a book that my dad had on the shelf in Oklahoma in the 1950s. And I read that, and maybe I was a really impressionable age, but that stuck with me for a long time. I think that rather than try to build another house of cards of 10 million people during the times of chaos, how can Canada build
please.
solar powered huts that are survivable for very cold winters, because we're still going to have cold winters, and extreme heat waves, because that overheating, it still is going to try and equilibrate throughout. That's what weather is. And so
I'm sorry,
that's the work to be done.
I don't have the third video done,
Ah,
but I do have the material. So if you go to the website, skill.org, and there's a big block that says Unwinding the Human Predicament, it actually talks about what happens during the 80 years. What are the responsibilities of various people as individuals, and why the thing might coalesce into this 10 million person civilization by design. You know, everybody working on making sure it happens, not worrying about how they're going to eat their next lunch or eat somebody else's lunch.
I think I've spoken enough, but I want to iterate what someone else said, is that if you're going to redo this, you can't be blind to the benefits on some scale of solar with no moving parts sitting there. I'd rather bet my great-grandson's life on a solar panel than a huge room filled with machinery that can't be machined locally, because we only have 10 million people here. I mean, those turbines, it's, you know,
No, you got it. You have to include in that 10 million person population the ability to maintain those turbines.
Okay, and it seems to me an arbitrary blind spot that you have against solar, which to me is my favorite. Even wind, although it's very attractive to have free energy out of the wind, especially in a windier climate anywhere on the planet. That's a lot of free energy that's going right over your head. And maybe it can't be scaled, you know, with, you know, the football field diameters that we use today. Maybe it has to be 5 of the small ones. There was a experimental design where a farmer could take his tractor, and with a cable, he could upright and lower his turbine so he could work on it on ground level. I mean, to me, there might be a practical limit to how big you want to make a turbine if you don't like turbines. But solar almost, it's so scalable. You know, it seems almost, I have to ask the question again, why did you not include solar? And my guess is because you did it 20 years ago when solar wasn't a great option. Now today, that might be the #1 option.
Well, the fact that you still believe that solar has net energy, if it is the primary driver of a civilization, means that you're only reading half of the available information.
Okay.
You've drunk the Kool-Aid. The people that say,
maybe,
hey, put this solar panel on your house, you'll pay for it in 8 years, and from there on, it's a cash cow. That's the Kool-Aid of the solar panel. But the fact is, it's a machine, and it turns sunlight into electricity, only lasts 15 to 20 years. And it's supported by a huge infrastructure that can't be maintained or scaled. So if you buy the best solar panel
of convincing me that with microgrids, there's a very good movement against, you know, the huge utility that does 5 states. You know, maybe we'd be better off with on a more manageable scale, because now the computers can control and coordinate these microgrids in a way that makes them efficient and workable.
Okay,
so I would rather have you talk to people on this chat who actually know many times more than I do. I will admit that I have not read everything on that, and my assumption is that solar right now would be a lot better than burning, for example, in my house, burning the methane, natural gas, which, you know, I was always feeling kind of cozy about, like, hey, I have the lowest cost energy that I can put in my house. I'm not going to heat my house with electricity in this day and age. And then later on in life, you say, oh, never mind, you have to change your opinion. So I'm willing to keep an open mind. I tell you what, I'm not sure I will be a great addition to your group, but I have a lot of time, and this is of extreme interest to me. And I will join you on Wednesday. Can I sign up through your website?
Yep.
Okay. So I'll introduce myself.
Right, Claude.
Thanks, Claude.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jack. John Meyer, do you have a question?
I guess just more a comment. I mean, it's been 12,000 years since we got into stratified societies, and we have yet to find a mechanism which is going to both be economically representative and resilient and socially resilient, that's going to allow the head to know what the feet are doing. Because all of our sophisticated societies of stratified societies have collapsed. And I saw one great comment yesterday in a video by a Russian expert. He said, the Russian troops that are looting the Ukraine, they're amazed by the wealth in Ukraine. They're trying to send washing machines and microwaves home. He said, they're from the far outreaches of the Russian Empire, if you will. He said, if you put them in, and they're angry because there's this disparity. He said, if you put them in Moscow, they would do exactly the same thing. And I thought that was a great comment. So they're not letting those troops, they don't ship them through Moscow. But anyway, I guess my point is that if we come up with a biophysical economics model that is more transparent than our current money-based economic model, we will end up, I believe, with more sustainable and more equitable society, and that gives us a better chance. Just making something small, making smaller versions of what we've got now doesn't work. I think we have to have things which represent the real world, metrics and models which represent the real world. And that gives Jack's theory a chance to work. But anything based on money isn't going to work. That's my point.
Okay, so wasn't the question?
Thank you.
Point. Okay, thanks.
Okay, thanks.
So Stephen Kurtz, do you have a question, please?
I think he's gone.
He's gone.
He's gone. Okay, let's just move on here.
We're coming up to 2 hours. We should be shutting down soon.
Right. Okay, so John Meyer, we're getting close. So you have another, I think maybe you included both in the same.
Yeah.
Same question. Okay, so we're coming to the end, I think. And so, Jack, I'd like to thank you very much for all the work you did to put this together. Your patience with an hour of questioning after that. And hopefully you'll get lots of feedback, which will help you in going forward in your project.
Thank you.
We're very happy to have you. Look forward to hearing part 3 at a later date.
Part 1 too.
And part 1 as well. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Don't keep us in suspense too long.